Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman is the Kurdistan regional government representative to the United States and comes from a long line of leaders in the Kurdish community. Bayan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm very excited to talk to you because we've talked a little bit about the Kurds here, and this is not a topic or a people that get really any play in the United States. I talked to Senator John McCain a bit about the Kurds. I've had a CIA operative who was in Kurdistan and Iraq talk a bit about it. But can you give me sort of Kurds 101? Who are these people? Where are they? And what is the history of these people?
Well, I'll go into ancient history. People may have heard of the Medes or the Mede Empire, which was also at the time of the Persian Empire. So we Kurds are the descendants of the Medes. Another reference to the Kurds, but not as Kurds as such, is in the Bible. One theory is that the three wise men who went to see Jesus at his birth, that they were actually from Kurdistan. So there are lots of references to the Kurds or our ancestors in various documents. Also, Alexander the Great fought some of his battles when he was invading the Middle East in Kurdistan as well. So lots and lots of historical references. But jumping to more recent history, to 19th and 20th century, Kurdistan was essentially divided between four countries after the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States put forward the idea of self-determination as a way for the nations in Europe and the Middle East to break away from the old empires and to determine their own future. And we, of course, supported President Wilson's theory because under that, self-determination would have meant independence for Kurdistan. But the powers at the time, the French, the British, they were the empires. They wanted to break up the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to create these different states in the Middle East. And so the people of Kurdistan were divided up. And that's the borders, those are the borders that we live with today. So there are Kurds in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria.
Right. So just to be clear for people that lose some of the history, so the Ottoman Empire basically ran the entire thing, and then the British came in, carved up some of this stuff. So during the carving of this, how did it happen that Kurdistan didn't come to be?
Well, in one set of negotiations immediately after the First World War, there was going to be an independent Kurdistan. And then the European powers, who were the superpowers at the time, made another deal whereby the French would have Syria, the British would have Iraq, and they decided to divide up the Kurds so that we would always be a balancing force. So, for example, in Iraq, they put Sunnis and Shias together, and they wanted the Kurds as the third element to balance the other two. Also, there's a lot of oil and gas in Kurdistan, and that was another reason to carve it up. But really, since the beginning of the 20th century, we Kurds have been divided up between these four borders. And unfortunately, those countries weren't democracies. They were dictatorships or authoritarian, basically not free societies. So to be Kurdish, to speak Kurdish, to talk about Kurdish rights basically was a no-no and got everybody into trouble, including many of my relatives from my grandfather onwards.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about your family history, but just to wrap up the historical portion of this. So right now, the Kurdish regional government exists, and that's who you work for, and they exist in Iraq, but the goal ultimately is that what will become Kurdistan, or what you hope will become Kurdistan, is going to encompass more area than you guys control right now. Is that fair to say?
When we talk about independence in my government, we're only talking about Iraqi Kurdistan. Mm-hmm. Of course, Kurds everywhere want independence, but officially I'm only talking about Iraqi Kurdistan. The Kurdistan regional government now controls all of the Kurdish territory in Iraq. Officially, we administer only part of it, But after we pushed ISIS out when they attacked us, we now have control of all of Kurdistani areas within Iraq. And we do want independence. Our president, President Barzani, has called for a referendum on self-determination to be held this year. And I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of the Kurdish people in Iraq will vote for independence. That doesn't mean that we're going to declare independence straight away. It just means that our leadership has the mandate or the authority to negotiate.
So why would someone that's Kurdish not vote for independence? What would be their reasoning?
I have no idea.
You're just assuming that not everybody's going to. There might be somebody with some good, business deals or something with Iraq that wants to remain an Iraqi citizen or something. Yes,
but Kurdistan is multicultural and multi-religious. So we're not all. I'm Kurdish, of course, and I'm a Sunni Muslim, and we make up the majority in Kurdistan. But in Iraqi Kurdistan, we have Christians. They are Assyrian, Chaldean. We have Yazidis. We have Shabaks, Kakis, and Arabs as well. So maybe some of those communities may think that, well, we would rather be under Iraqi authority. But I'm confident that the vast majority of people who will vote in the referendum would rather have self-determination than be under the authority of Baghdad.
I'm reminded of our election here in 2007 when Joe Biden, who was actually at the time running against Barack Obama in the Democratic primary, and they were asking, well, what do you do with Iraq? And he said, well, Iraq actually needs to be partitioned between the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds. And everyone kind of laughed at him because it just sounded so ridiculous. You know what I mean? We were in the midst of this war that we were trying to get out of. But in a way, he was right? I mean, having this split by more sensible ethnic lines would lead to the state that you want.
To be honest, Iraq has never worked as a state. It was created about 100 years ago, 90 to 100 years ago. It has had a history of violence within the country, so violence against the government, between the government and the people, history of violence against neighbors. It's been a destabilizing force in the Middle East, and internally, the people of Iraq have suffered, not just the Kurds, the Arabs too. We've had repeated acts of genocide. And the worst period was, of course, under Saddam Hussein, when we had chemical bombardment, repeated acts of genocide against the Barzanis, the Failis, Halabja. The anniversary of Halabja is on the 16th of March, by the way. Mm-hmm. So we've had this kind of suffering and violence in Iraq ever since it was created. It's never gelled. It's true that under Saddam Hussein, there was less public violence that you see now. Now we see these huge suicide bombings and, there was almost civil war around 2006 and 2007 in Iraq between the Shias and the Sunnis. But there was huge amount of repression and violence under Saddam. It's just that the world didn't know about it.
So is that the irony of what's going on here? I feel like there's a little bit of rewriting of history going on where people keep saying that America led to ISIS. Now, clearly, had Saddam been there right now, there's every reason to think he would have kept ISIS down if they had started percolating up. But people sort of forget how horrible Saddam and the Ba'ath Party, what they were doing to dissidents and free thinkers, and certainly the Kurds, 1988 gassing of the Kurds, et cetera. People sort of have rewritten this where it somehow comes off that Saddam was almost a good guy, which is the furthest thing that he ever was.
I agree with you. It's very frustrating that we see that for many people, the history of Iraq began in 2003. I wish it began in 2003. It didn't. It began, 80, 90 years earlier. And as I said, Iraq has had a history of coups d'etats, a violent transfer of power from one government to another, lots and lots of people disappearing, people buried alive. I mean, the horrors and the violence in Iraq are the precursor to what we're seeing today. And I don't think the United States can be blamed for everything. There are mistakes that the United States has made, absolutely. But ultimately, we Iraqis need to also be held responsible for the failure of the state. Iraq is a failed state. and it should never have been created. It was created, and a dictator managed to keep it together. But who wants to live under a dictatorship? And
Yeah.
for us Kurds, Iraq has failed us repeatedly. I can't think of what good thing we have seen out of being part of Iraq. And so why on earth shouldn't we be able to choose and determine our future, just like the people of Quebec in Canada, the people of Scotland in the United Kingdom? They have had referendums on independence. Ultimately, they decided to stay with their countries. That's fine. That's their choice. Give us the choice. That's all we're asking for.
Right, so that's the fascinating part of this. All you guys are asking for is the choice, and then as you said, most Kurds probably will vote for their own state, but you just want the choice to do it. I'm curious, what do you think of, right before the American withdrawal from Iraq a few years ago, there were free elections in Iraq by most measures. Things seemed to be turning for the better, and then I guess the vacuum that existed after we left, things turned for the worse. Do you think had we stayed, not to say we should have stayed, not to say we should have went in the first place, but do you think, facts being as they are, had we stayed, would the Kurds and the Iraqis be in a better position right now?
I definitely think that US influence in Iraq diminished dramatically after the withdrawal of the troops. There was an attempt by the United States to reach an agreement with the then Prime Minister Maliki to leave a force in Iraq, but the United States, I think, wanted immunity for its forces, and Baghdad was not willing to give it. So there was an attempt to leave a residual force there, and that would have made all the difference. Because really, in the Middle East, I'm afraid we are still at the stage of evolution where force is what gives you authority. Shared values, these kind of values of freedom and liberty and freedom of speech, they're wonderful, but frankly, they're a luxury. In much of the Middle East, it's who's got the gun that counts. And so the withdrawal of the US forces completely diminished US influence. Absolutely, that's inevitable. Meanwhile, the neighbors, they're making the most of the vacuum.
Yeah, so how did the Kurds come to be the way, everything that I see about the Kurds, right? I mean, I literally see pictures of women fighters, women that look like Western women fighting ISIS, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But how did the ethos of the Kurds, where you guys do respect minorities, as you said, the Yazidis and many others, and there is a feeling that Western values are good within the Kurdish community, how did that actually flourish amongst so many places that you're surrounded by that it doesn't flourish at all?
I think we have a tradition, part of our heritage, part of our culture, is to be looking for peaceful coexistence. And so Christians, Yazidis, many other minorities, Shabaks, Kakis, Kurds, Arabs, we have lived side by side in peace and harmony, and we have that tradition. I mean, even now, when it's Christmas, I will phone my Christian friends in Kurdistan and congratulate them, and when it's our festivities, they will do the same. My mother, she was born in the 1940s in Sinjar. She was from a Muslim family. The first school that she attended was run by Christian nuns. So this culture of coexistence has been part of our heritage, and it's just very normal. It's not something that's imposed by law or by government. We do have laws in place. We do have quotas, for example, for our parliament, where the minorities have allocated an allocated number of seats. Whether they get the votes or not, they get those seats. We have laws and so on, but actually, more important than that, it's part of our culture. And I think that's something we're proud of and we want to defend. And when you're surrounded by authoritarian regimes that destroy everything, you want to be with the underdog. We are the underdogs, and we want to be with fellow persecuted people. And I think there's that sort of idea of common good that we all share.
Why do you think this story, I mean, this whole story of your people is completely ignored in the West? People just simply don't talk about it, which is exactly why I wanted to talk about it. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, thank you for talking about it.
You're welcome.
I suppose there are many reasons. One is the Kurdish story is complicated. As much as I might try to simplify it, but I also want to be truthful to the story, it's a complicated story, and I think that makes it difficult. The other is, frankly speaking, money, right? To really run an effective campaign where you win people to your side, you need money. You need to propagate soft power. We need universities to be teaching about Kurdistan. We need advertising campaigns saying, come to Kurdistan, it's a wonderful tourism destination. We need heavy lobbying, particularly a country like the United States, and it's such a vast country everywhere, not just in Washington, D.C. That needs money, and we've never had that kind of money. But, there are very, very successful examples. I would say Israel, has massive support in the United States. The Jewish community here is very proactive. Of course, the community itself is proactive, but it takes money, which we don't have.
So I was going to mention, actually, the Israel situation, because I think it's sort of interesting. In America and in most of the world, we spend so much time talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the wider conflict with the Arab world. And to me, it seems that it's the only reason we talk about it so much, and we're talking about the most ridiculously tiny piece of land on earth, is because it's simple to frame the argument. It's Jews versus Arabs, or Jews versus Muslims, however you want to frame it. And I think the story of the Kurds, because it's confused, are Kurds Muslim? It makes it much more confusing, much less people don't understand the Sunni-Shia divide. So that it really has a lot to do with just defining what the actual problem is in a sort of simple way.
That's true, and I think one very worrying factor that's we're seeing now in the United States, but also in Europe, is this fear of the Muslim, the fear that every Muslim is out to kill us, and fortunately that is not true. I know that might be the perception, and I'm not denying that there are Muslims who want to kill Americans or Europeans, and ISIS has a distorted version of Islam that it wants to propagate. But the vast majority of Kurds are Muslim. But I would say we're moderate. We believe in coexistence. It's part of our culture. We look to the West and we admire the West. We admire the progress, the technology, the advances in science and health, putting a man on the moon, hopefully a woman on the moon soon, and so on. And we admire that, and we want part of it. It doesn't mean that we're going to let go of our culture and our heritage and, become, I don't know, Palm Beach or something. Kurdistan will be Kurdistan and will have its culture. But why not share what we have with you and you with us, and we can both benefit from it?
Yeah, so in a weird way, it almost sounds to me like the society you're trying to build in some ways is so reverse of what goes on in that part of the world. It's hard for people to wrap their brains around that this could happen. It almost would exacerbate, it would show people, wow, Iraq really did fail because look what's happening in Iraq. But meanwhile, somehow the Kurds did it. So it really flips everything on its head that, that this flower could happen in the middle of the desert.
I think Kurdistan is the success story in Iraq, and it needs to be nurtured. I think your description of it as a flower is apt. I think it is a flower, but like every flower, it needs to be tended, it needs to be nurtured. It can easily be knocked down. And this is really where we are today. I should say, though, Kurdistan is an island of stability and peaceful coexistence, but there are other places in the Middle East too. I don't want to make out it's just Kurdistan. If you look at Lebanon, of course they have problems. I don't want to, but Lebanon has Arabs, Druze, Christians, Muslims. There are other places around the Middle East. It's just that they're not allowed to thrive. And this is where the United States can really play a role. Nurture these places that do look to the West, that do want to share values of human rights and liberty, and want to do business with the United States, for example, but they need nurturing because we are surrounded by hostile attitudes.
Yeah, it's funny. I think actually, in a way, you're proving my point because we don't talk about Lebanon either, which, yeah, there are Christians and Muslims in Lebanon that are getting along. So every time something's good happening in the Middle East, for some reason, we seem unable to talk about it. But let's talk a little bit about your family history because you come from a long line of people in your family that have helped the Kurdish movement for a long time, and you've paid the price personally. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess a good starting point is my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. My family is originally from Sinjar, which most people know as a Yazidi town, but actually in the old days it used to be mixed, Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen and others. And my grandfather was very prominent, played a very prominent role in Sinjar, advocating for people's rights and so on. And he and many, many of my relatives, including male, female, and children relatives, have been imprisoned, exiled, tortured, various things, basically because they stood up for Kurdish rights. Then my father and mother, both of them also played a very important role in the Kurdish liberation movement. My father was actually in the leadership of one of the political parties, and he was a Peshmerga in his young days, carrying arms and fighting the Iraqi regime at the time. Then he evolved into a statesman and a diplomat. My mother was a housewife and a mother,
Yeah.
which usually
those are needed too. Those are needed
but
too.
society dismisses people like that. But she was also a campaigner. I mean, she really campaigned for Kurdistan and for people's rights. And my father at one time was kind of prime minister in exile of a Kurdistan regional government in exile. This was in the 1970s. And then in the late 90s, he became the deputy prime minister of the Kurdistan region. And at the time that he was killed in 2004, he was deputy prime minister. So you said that my family had paid the price. We have, but I don't want to exaggerate my family's situation because many, many Kurdish people have suffered enormously, and my family is just like theirs. In February 2004, my elder brother and my father were killed in a suicide bombing by Islamist extremists, along with many other people. And of course, it had a huge impact on my family, on me personally. And so today in my work, I'm very proud of the legacy that I've inherited, and I feel that I have a very high standard to live up to. So I have to make sure I don't let down what they built up, and that I continue to serve my people the way they did and the way they wanted me to.